Mr. Kretchen used to call us the third party and apologize for his action. But well, it was no accident.
No,
But yeah,
exactly.
I worry about that in this current campaign. Is the only thing that'll make you put a flag on your house or
Mhm,
your car, your antagonism to Donald Trump. Don't we have anything that you
mhm.
can be proud of in Canada itself, regardless of who the president of the United States is?
Concepts with Shawn.
Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving into a fascinating topic with Preston Manning, founder of the Reform Party and an expert on Canadian populism. You know, the Reform Party was founded in the 1980s and disappeared long ago, but the Reform Party ideas continue to influence politics today. We'll explore the origins and the political landscape that led to its creation. Next, we'll examine the broader scope of Canadian populism. What does populism mean in a Canadian context? How has it manifested in different movements beyond the Reform Party itself? Finally, we'll unpack regional identities within the country, and I think you'll be shocked by what you hear. We'll also take a look at what makes Canada great beyond a shallow anti-Americanism. I hope you enjoy this episode. Preston Manning is a politician, a legislator, a writer, and an author. He is a founder of the Reform Party of Canada and was leader of the official opposition in Canada. It's really impossible to summarize everything Preston has done, but suffice it to say, when Preston Manning speaks, people listen. Welcome, Preston.
Well, thank you, Shawn. That's a very generous introduction. But I'll try to live up to it. Yeah.
There you go. No, I know you will. So I've been reading a lot about Canadian conservatism, and it's impossible to understand conservatism in Canada without understanding the Reform Party. And so I was wondering if you could just tell us the story of the Reform Party and what were you thinking? Why did you form it? What opposition were you up against? And what were the ideas that were motivating you? Because the Reform Party ideas, I think we're seeing in a lot of policies today. So can you take us on that journey?
Well, this goes back to the late 1980s, early 1990s, when the West was alienated, increasingly alienated from the policies of the federal government under Pierre Elliott Trudeau. The National Energy Program took $110 billion worth of wealth from the Western provinces and the producers and transferred it basically to central Canada. The Mulroney administration made some headway, but then they ended up taking a contract that should have gone to Winnipeg and throwing it to Montreal. And anyway, there was this discontent in the West, and I was conscious that the Western Canada has a third-party tradition, a populist tradition, actually. It's just like Quebec has a third-party tradition. These are two parts of the country that do not go back and forth provincially between conservatives and liberals, but have these third parties. I was conscious that there was starting to be the ingredients for a third-party movement in the West, and that if it wasn't constructive and federalist, it could very easily at that time have gone in a separatist direction. The Separatist Party elected a member to the Alberta legislature. So typical of Westerners, there was 5 of us met in a boardroom in Calgary to discuss what's to be done. Of course, we couldn't agree. Had to be done, but we at least identified the options. We said, look, the options are to try to work within an existing party, which would have been the federal Conservatives, whether to start a new interest group or pressure group that would lobby more effectively for Western interests, or what about the third party tradition, which, and I was on the side of that. There was others that thought differently. So anyway, what we could agree on was, well, let's organize a conference to discuss these options and vote on them, which was held in Vancouver. And these various options were put forward, and they were quite real. Unfortunately, I wrote to Brian Mulroney saying, look, I think there's an unrest out here that is not being recognized. Why don't you send your best person, which would have been Don Mazinkowski, who was a respected Western MP, cabinet minister, deputy prime minister. Why don't you send Don to argue that the Conservative Party, federal Conservative Party, is still the best vehicle for this? And Mulroney wrote back and said, no, you have already decided to create a third party, which was not true. It hadn't happened. But not only will I not send Mazinkowski, I'll order all of my MPs to stay away from any conference to discuss it. So anyway, this conference was held in Vancouver. The various options were presented, and I made the case for, I think it's time for a third-party option, and that was received. There was a big vote on it, and it received the largest number of votes. So then it authorized setting up a constitutional conference to actually form the party, which was done shortly thereafter, and reform got underway.
So how did you know how to do all that? So you had already been in politics for a long time?
My father had been premier of Alberta for 25 years. Our family used to keep track of time by provincial elections. I can still recite them now. 1935, 40, 45, 44, 48, 52, 59, and 63, 71.
Wow.
We kept track of that. So I had some background in political organizing and policy development, things like that. But as I mentioned, the West has had this third-party tradition. As soon as you started talking about, there's people came out of the woodwork that were quite familiar with that. So we got it going, and then this was just before the 1988 election, so there wasn't much time to do anything, and we managed to run 72 candidates. None of us won anything. Stephen Harper was one of the candidates, but we finished second in 11 seats, and it was just enough of encouragement to suggest, well, maybe we should keep going. And then there was a by-election held immediately after. One of the Conservative elected MPs died of cancer very shortly after the election, which created a by-election opportunity in Beaver River in Alberta, big rural riding, one that we would do well in. And Deborah Gray was our candidate there. She's a school teacher on the Frog Lake Reserve, and a very people-oriented person. And Deborah would be more a small d Democrat first, and then a Conservative secondly. And we decided that Deborah would be an excellent candidate to run again in the by-election, that I would not run as the leader. I would spend my time running across the country. And lo and behold, we won that by-election. So we got a toehold in the federal parliament, and then worked away in 200 meetings a year for 5 years, running across the country from Tofino in British Columbia to East Cape in Newfoundland, and we managed to get it put together. So in 93, that was the breakthrough election for us in the West and for the Bloc in Quebec. Two parties that hardly existed 5 years before got 104 seats in that parliament. A very unusual development, and that's where we were the third party, or Mr. Kretchen used to call us the turd party, and apologize for his action. But well, it was no accident.
No, exactly.
Yeah. Oh,
he had a sense of humor too.
Yeah. So anyway, that's sort of how we got going, and
Right. So 200 meetings a year, across the country. My sense of populism, and if I can use that word, or even of people who want to challenge the institutions and say, hey, listen, you're locking us out, is that emotion, that passion often isn't the same kind of character traits that you need to form a team and to stick together. So how did you herd all these people together, or were they naturally wanting to come together?
Well, a couple of points. I think you make a very important point about populism. I've argued, and I argued with some political science professors and journalists, that the old left, right, center way of conceptualizing politics, of describing the political landscape, is out of date. In fact, I get political science students who say, if you've got a professor that can't discuss politics except in left, right, center, ask him if he also believes the earth is flat. Because I think he's operating in a different, and then at the newer framework, and this explains developments in at least 15 countries around the world, including the election of Mr. Trump. The new axis is between political parties that are guided and managed by aristocratic elites. and versus bottom-up democratic populists. I think that is the new axis, and then the challenge becomes, as you say, if one is involved with one of these bottom-up democratic expressions, how do you make sure that it's a responsible contribution? And there's a great quotation. Well, there's two quotations. One is from de Tocqueville, a French commentator who visited the United States in the 1830s and wrote the book Democracy in America. And he said at that time, this is a long time back, he said the main division between the American political parties is not what became the Democrats and the Republicans, but it's between those that are animated by the aristocratic passion and wish to reduce the role of ordinary people in the governance of their affairs, and those animated by the democratic passion, which wish to expand it, which is a pretty good conceptual framework. And then the other quote from American politics, Jefferson lived until 1820 something, quite elderly, and somebody wrote to him and said, if you were redoing the American Constitution, would you give as much power to these ordinary people to elect a president, elect a Congress, elect a Senate? And Jefferson replied, I can think of no safer depository for the ultimate powers of society than in the people themselves. And then anticipating this question, but leave it to the people themselves. They're uneducated. They don't understand the issues. They'll chase after some dictator that promises them something. And this was a meaningful question at that time because Andrew Jackson, who was he was the Trump of his day. He was on the scene. He was not from Virginia. He used to show up at receptions in Washington with two pistols stuck in his belt. Like he was, and recognizing that. And so Jefferson added, and if you think them, the people themselves, not fit to exercise self-government properly, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion. Which is a very good, solid piece of advice. So if you're going to lead or become part of a populist movement, what you also need is some way, shape, or form of informing the discretion of these rank and file people that make this thing up. And the phrase itself is interesting. He did not say the elite should tell them what to think. He said you should give them the ingredients to allow them to come to the right conclusion. Don't tell them what to think. Give them the ingredients so that they can come by themselves to the right conclusion. And I think that's a long time ago, that advice, but I think that's part of the clue to making sure that a populist movement is a constructive force, not a destructive one.
Yeah. So did you come up with these quotations and this explanation decades into reform work or after it? Or did you know this in the 1970s and 80s when you were developing these ideas?
Well, I knew de Tocqueville. I didn't see that one from Jefferson until later. I can't remember who pointed it out to me. But the one of the great sources of information on this, and I argued this with political scientists and commentators, in North America, there is no part of North America that has more experience with populist movements and populist governments. A lot of these populist movements never get to government, but Western Canada has had more experience with these movements and ones that got to government. Right from the get-go, the old United Farmers, the Farmers' Parties formed the United Farmers of Ontario, United Farmers of Manitoba, United Farmers of Alberta, all formed governments. They were bottom-up farm movements that protested the tariffs of the day, nothing new, and protested the freight rates. The United Farmers of Alberta managed to get the constitutional amendment that gave ownership of the natural resources of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta to the provinces. The constitutional amendment, most important, most significant to the Western provinces. And then the Depression parties, both of them, the CCF in Saskatchewan, the Social Credit in Alberta, both of these were bottom-up populist movements. Both of them ended up in government. The Saskatchewan NDP, whatever or CCF, whatever you think of them, they pioneered Medicare, which surely many people would consider a major advancement. And the social credit regime in Alberta presided over an oil boom. And it was one of the few governments in North America to be in power when oil was discovered that didn't corrupt itself by that. So I believe by studying the experience of these Western Canadian populations, you can learn a lot about how to manage them, how to lead them, what mistakes they can make, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, brilliant. So it's fascinating that you mentioned some of the accomplishments of these various populist governments when they actually get into government, because the sense you get is that populists simply want to burn everything down and tear down government, whereas you've given a few concrete examples of how they actually were able to get into government and make change.
One of the ones I usually raise at the university, how did the first women get into elected assemblies or get into the Parliament of Canada? The first woman to be elected to a Democratic Assembly in the British Empire was Louise McKinney in the Alberta legislature in 1918, and she ran for an outfit called the Non-Partisan League. It was a populist organization. And then the first one in Ottawa was Agnes Campbell MacPhail, and who did she run for? She ran for the old Progressive Party, which was the federal equivalent of the Farmers' parties. She was opposed by the Liberals, she was opposed by the Conservatives, but she got there through a populist movement. So these movements, particularly if they're well run, can accomplish positive things, and there's an enormous amount of energy behind them if they get on the right track.
So the enormous amount of energy is right where I wanted to go. You have a beautiful analogy of a wildcat well or something, and can you tell us that?
Well, it's an Alberta analogy, but in the oil patch there is such a thing as a wildcat well, where the drillers go out and drill someplace that nobody else has on the hope of hitting gas or oil. And most of them get a dry hole and go broke, but occasionally they hit something with enormous amount of energy, boils up, and it can turn into a rogue well. It can blow the drilling platform or the drilling rig off the platform. It can catch fire and become very dangerous, but there's an enormous amount of energy there if you could ever harness it. And one way, particularly in the old days of dealing with a rogue well, was to drill in a relief well from the side. And it had to be at the right angle. If it was too shallow, it wouldn't take off enough pressure. If it was too deep, it could turn into a rogue well, but if it was just right, it could take the pressure off, and they could install valves and harness this energy that was available there. And I used to think of reform. I was aware of that analogy from the oil patch before we ever did the political thing, but I thought of reform as a relief well. There was this anger, some of it potentially turning into separatism as a result of the National Energy Program in particular. And you had to identify with that. You couldn't stand off. You had to identify with it. You had to drill right into it. But you could then say, okay, look, we understand why you're mad, and we're mad too. But instead of blowing everything apart, why don't we turn this energy into trying to alter the federal policies and change the nature of the federation? And that's where reform was, that kind of a relief well.
So you mentioned identifying with that energy. How do you make the jump from identifying with this powerful energy and actually getting work done that is often very slow and boring and low energy, at least to people watching from the outside? Did you ever find yourself caught between the realities of doing politics and the passion of your constituents?
Well, I think one way to direct that passion is to give them something to do, and to have a to-do list. You don't just have fiery speeches where everybody gets fired up, but okay, what do we do? Don't let people go away from that meeting saying, this is great, but what do we do? So having a to-do list. And of course, with reform, it was quite simple and political. We got to form constituency associations not going to be able to nominate candidates or run for election. So why don't you, all you guys that are mad and want to go do something, why don't you go and create a constituency association in your riding, which people did and did very quickly. In fact, going back historically in the social credit era, that was in the Depression when the Western economy was just devastated. It was the agricultural economy, and Alberta's GDP dropped by more than 50%. Can you imagine? I mean, during COVID, we had a 8% contraction of the economy. Can you imagine a 50% contraction? And of course, people were just furious. And William Aberhart, who was a high school principal in Calgary, and had pioneered religious and political radio broadcasting in Canada. He was one of the first guys to use radio to talk to large numbers of people in the 1920s. He got onto this social credit idea that if you expand if the economy was faltering, you could expand the money supply to crank the pump until it became inflationary. Then you had to stop. But he thought of himself as an educator. He would talk about this on these programs of his, but they started to form little groups across the province to listen to him. And Aberhart thought of himself as an educator, didn't want to get into politics, but these little groups decide we're going to get into politics whether you want to or not. And they went out and created constituency association. And by God, in 1935 election, they ran candidates against Aberhart's desire. And Albertans threw every last member of the previous government, the premier, the cabinet, and every last MLA out of the legislature and put in these new people. But that those people were given something to do. In this case, it was organized politically, and I think that's one of the keys to making sure that populist energy is constructively directed.
So now, should we get the sense that everybody in Alberta aligns more with the populist energy, or is there a large contingent of essentially Laurentian elite types that are the old empire loyalist types?
Yeah, no, but not everybody agrees with this. Often a lot of the misunderstanding and oppositions at the universities. You have very few political scientists at the universities subscribe to or even understand this. There's very few books or articles have been written objectively on these populist movements, all the way from Riel to the farmers' parties to the progressives to social credit and CCF. So there's quite a contingent, and particularly in Edmonton, where you've got the academics of the University of Alberta, you've got the labor union, public service unions, who are generally they subscribe to a form of populism, but the labor leadership has to be on top of it. Right. So at the end of the day, the rank and file member doesn't have much to say about it. And then you've got the public service, the large public service, and a lot of civil servants are afraid of these populist movements because they'll be disruptive, that they'll do things like Mr. Trump is doing. So there's not a unanimous support for populism, but there's enough of it to be a factor.
Yeah. So given your experience, it's overused phrase, herding cats, or dealing with these high energy groups. People talk about Canada being a country of regions, and it's difficult to hold together at the best of times. It seems like, especially in our larger cities now, it's difficult to find something that holds us together, that makes us stick together. What are your thoughts on Canada, and what is the basis of our stickiness when it comes to being a country?
Well, I think you hit on it by starting out on the recognition of Canada as a nation of regions. And I think that's fundamentally important. In fact, I'd like to see federal political party, particularly the Conservatives, officially recognize the regional character of Canada. Say, look, this country, it's the second largest country by landmass on the planet, and it should be understandable it's going to be regionalized. You got the Atlantic region, you got the Laurentian region, which has the Ontario and the Quebec divisions of it. You have the Prairie region, you have the Pacific region, and you have the Northern region. And each of these regions, I would argue, have unique, or use the Quebec word, distinctive. It has aspirations and concerns that are distinctive to that region. And it seems to me part of the key to unifying the country is for a national government to identify each of these and not to regard them as problems. Say, this is perfectly understandable in a country of this size. And to say, as a government, we're going to recognize and endeavor to address the distinctive aspirations and concerns of each region on one condition, that when we address the concerns of one region, the rest of you regions support us. Don't start to complain. We're going to get to your region, but let's recognize the regional character, and when initiatives are taken to address the distinctives in one region, let's be supportive of that rather than opposed to it. And one of the funny things on this subject, at one of our conventions, we had a panel in which we asked them to distinguish what are the distinctive characteristics of conservatism in their region. So the Atlantic person said tradition. The Quebec guy said soft nationalism. The Toronto guy said business.
Wow.
The Prairie guy, which was linked Byfield, said revolution.
Wow.
And the BC guy said polarization and being at the right end of the pole. Now, these are all professed conservatives, and the definition ranged all the way from traditionalism to revolution.
Wow.
Now, how do you find an overarching theme that can resonate with all? That's one of the real challenges in national politics in this country. You can find something that resonates this region or that region, but to find the overall something that resonates everywhere, that's the real challenge, and it's a real challenge to national leadership as distinct from regional leadership.
Yeah. So I like the federalist kind of vibe or federalism vibe that I get from you in talking about regions. If so, you and I like federalism, then how do we, is nationalism just a collection of regions? Or I'm thinking of George Grant and his Canadian nationalism, and very anti-American, but he also had some substance to what he thought Canada was beyond simply being anti-American. Have you changed your mind?
That's right there. I think that's very important. I think, and this is a worry right now with this concern about Trump. If the only definition they have of being a Canadian is being anti-American or being anti-Trump, that's a pretty sad conceptualization of your own country. Don't we have anything that you can be proud of in Canada itself, regardless of who the president of the United States is? And I think that's where you can start to develop a concept of Canadian nationalism. And I start even with the reason. You live in the second largest country on the face of the planet. You're the only ones that can say that.
Wow.
You probably got the first and second, or either the first or the second largest stock of natural resources. More energy, agriculture resources, mining, forestry, and fishery resources than any other country in the world except maybe Russia. You have the longest coastline of any other country in the world, 1.5 times longer than the coastline of the United States. Are these not things that we can be proud of? And then we have a history, and I gently point this out to our American friends. We separated from the mother country without a revolutionary war by a boring to tedious legislative process, but we didn't kill anybody. We managed, being part of the British Empire, to abolish slavery without a civil war. And we have never had a national government that actually declared war on its indigenous people. We have a unique tradition that way. But unless you, and I say to our American friends, unless you think we won't fight when we have to, we joined the British in fighting autocracy in the First World War 3 years before the United States. We declared war on Hitler and the Nazis 3 years before the United States. But then we cooperate with the United States in continental defense, and particularly in the Pacific. So I think there's a list of things in our geographic distinctiveness, in our historical and cultural heritage that gives us a lot to be proud of, and that defines a Canadianism without descending into, well, the only thing that'll make us wave the flag, and I worry about that in this current campaign, is the only thing that'll make you put a flag on your house or your car, your antagonism to Donald Trump. You're going to allow an American president to dictate who the next prime minister of Canada is?
Yeah.
What does that say about Canadian democracy?
Yeah.
And I think those are stories that we, or points we have to build on, and a lot of it involves communicating those things to our younger people, communicating those things to these hundreds of thousands of new Canadians. Don't have the faintest idea that that's what Canada is. And nobody, to their credit, nobody told them that. They were brought into this country with virtually no preparation for their employment, for their services, for their political involvement. And there's whole groups of Canada that need to have a discussion on what is a Canadian. If you don't know, let me tell you, or let me find somebody that can.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel guilty myself, Preston, listening to you give that list of what makes Canada awesome. I'm just cheering from the sidelines, and I'm thinking, goodness, I'm going to have to memorize that list myself, because to be able to say it, and to say it authentically and with passion and conviction, you practiced that a few times. You've said that before.
I have. Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's a very current question. We have young people in our own family that have asked me. They're at university. A couple of them are playing hockey in the United States, so they're getting their education there, but asking exactly what is a Canadian?
Yeah.
Or why should I come back to Canada? What's the difference? And so there's a lot of work to be done there, but there's a lot of material to build the case.
Yeah, beautiful. So before we get too rosy-eyed about Canada, I wanted to talk about what we fight about some more. So I grew up in Northern Ontario, and everything wrong with Canada had to do with Toronto and Quebec. And so
this would have in common with Western Canada.
That's right. So now I live just north of Toronto, and I've grown to like it. And I actually love Quebec now. I think, boy, they fight for themselves, and yeah, you go get them. And even Alberta, Daniel Smith is Premier Smith rather is linking arms with Quebec. Do you think that we need more of that spirit of, no, we want to fight for our region? Now, notwithstanding, I know at the federal level, it's going to take a particular kind of leadership to be able to manage that energy. But at the provincial level or at the regional level, would you be saying to people, look at Quebec, they're doing a good job of defending their uniqueness. Look at Alberta, they're doing a good job or a better job. Or is that just too divisive for the country as a whole?
Well, I think listen entirely to what they're saying. Like one of the things Alberta and Quebec have in common is both want a more decentralized federation. Quebec more for social, linguistic, cultural reasons, the West for economic reasons, but the common ground is a more decentralized federation. And I think both those regions would argue this would be better for everybody, and it would reduce a lot of this federal provincial tension that goes on and on and on. And at the practical level, one of the best things whoever the new government is, particularly if it's a conservative government, could do is pass, or at least what I've called an act respecting provincial jurisdiction, whereby the federal government introduces legislation amending those statutes that authorize federal intrusion in areas of provincial responsibility, which are what? Health care. This would be near and dear to your heart. Natural resources. The federal government has intervened on that through its No Pipelines Act, its Impact Assessment Act. Municipal government. The federal government is using the Canada Mortgage Bank to bypass the provinces and deal with municipalities on infrastructure. There's a number of these
federal spending power.
Yeah. Oh, yes. That's actually the whole federal spending power is used to get into these provincial areas. And if the federal government would withdraw from those areas, and you're not saying there's nothing for the federal government to do, the Constitution gives them lots to do. There's nobody disputes that they should be in charge of our our foreign relations. Nobody disputes that they should be in charge of defense and national security, an area which they've neglected. They've been spending all their time in these provincial areas and neglecting areas where nobody disputes that they should be involved. No one disputes that they should be involved in immigration, but handle it properly. So rebalancing this responsibility between the provincial and the federal governments, if it's done right, I think could be a very unifying force. And a lot of the advocates of that are at the provincial level. And then they're not just arguing for provincial jurisdiction, they're arguing for a better balance between federal and provincial.
Sure. So again, I'm trying to find something that we disagree with. Disagree on, Preston. I agree with you, but so I thought that this I shared this question with you just before we started taping, so you know what's coming here. Will Alberta ever not be a colony? We have 122 seats coming from Ontario, 78 federal seats in Quebec, and only mid-30s, 34 or 37 seats from Alberta. Is this really a losing battle for the West wanting in?
No, I don't think so. Alberta has an economic weight in the Federation. It's got nothing to do with those allocations of seats. The contribution that this petroleum sector is making to the national coffers and national economic growth is a way out of proportion to the size of the province or the size of its population. So if you look at economic federalism as distinct from political federalism, the way Alberta carries a way more than its weight. Eventually, maybe there will be some constitutional changes, although the capacity to amend the Canadian Constitution is virtually non-existent. But this concept of an elected Senate with genuine distribution between the provinces. In the U.S., that's one of the characteristics of their Senate that makes it a very strong force for national unity. Every state, no matter how big or how small, has 2 senators, and they're elected senators. They're not appointed like ours. So Senate reform, Harper tried to take a step in that direction by at least, can we not democratize the place? Can we at least not get elected senators? Alberta has this Senate selection process whereby you can elect candidates for the prime minister to appoint. And so there's things that could be done in that area to rebalance the Federation. One of the other characteristics that changes that could be made to provide more balance for the regions is just to have freer votes in the parliament, so that the member, even the Liberal member from Alberta, that's a very rare bird, but if there's such a thing, can disagree with his own party, can vote in a different way without defeating the government. I tried to get Jean Chrétien. I said, I'll write out a 20-second statement, and all you have to do is get up in the House of Commons and read it, which he said, I don't think I will. But the statement was that the government would not resign unless it was defeated on an explicit motion of non-confidence. So if it lost a vote on Section 43, subsection B of some government bill, the government didn't have to fall down. So its members could say, well, I happen to disagree with that. In my region, my constituents disagree with it. So I'm going to vote against that, but I'm not going to bring down the government. If there's a confidence motion, of course I'll support the government. And so some of these changes, Senate reform, at least to democratize itself, greater use of free votes, at least free votes in the House of Commons, these would provide better opportunity for the less populated regions to have an impact on national affairs greater than what they have now.
Have the prime ministers been acknowledging the elected candidates that Alberta puts forward? Didn't Jean Chrétien famously say, "Well, we're not going to look at your"?
Yeah, no, Chrétien didn't. Mulroney was forced to. One of the first ones that I think it was the first one we did it on was Don Getty managed to agreed to pass this legislation in Alberta to facilitate the Senate selection process, and one of our first candidates for that. In fact, he got more votes to be in Ottawa than any other politician in Canada's history, because his constituency was
Right.
Alberta-wide, was Stan Waters, a former
Wow.
commando and commander of the Canadian Armed Forces. And Stan won the Senate selection, but Mulroney wouldn't appoint him. And so we had Stan going around giving speeches and that for about, I can't remember, 7 or 8 months. But finally, there was something Mulroney wanted Getty to do, and Don said he wouldn't do it unless they put Stan Waters in the Senate, because 600,000 Albertans said that's where he should be.
Sure.
And so Mulroney reluctantly put him in. They gave him a seat at the very back end, the back corner of the Senate. And said, I campaigned with Stan, and one day we got reflecting on Cicero, the great Roman senator, who, no, it wasn't Cicero, it was Cato, who, Cato the Elder ended every speech he ever made in the Roman Senate. We would stop at the end. They could be arguing about dog catchers or whatever. He would stop and say, and besides all that, Carthage should be destroyed. And so Stan resolved that he would end every speech he ever made in the Senate was, and besides all that, whatever he was talking about, the Senate should be reformed.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Yeah. So I wanted to circle back just for a second to economic federalism. And I agree with too much of what you're saying. The thought, I've heard this term recently, the petro state, and where if an economy is focused too much, or a country is focused too much on one particular, in our case, oil coming all from Alberta, it doesn't really incentivize, or we haven't really put the same effort into encouraging development of other resources, or even oil and gas in other parts of the country. So you get a bunch of rent sinking, people trying to piggyback off the work of Alberta and being able to say, oh, look how environmentally pure we are in the rest of the country because we don't deal with that dirty oil. So how do we get around the idea that part of the reason the rest of the country is able to exist is because Alberta does so much? How can we get Newfoundland to develop its oil and gas and the other industries in Canada?
Well, I think one of the things that can and should be done, and most of the Alberta premiers have been strong on this, is it's the resource sectors, period. It's not just petroleum.
Right.
This country, its fundamental building blocks, in my judgment, are its resource sectors, and those are agriculture, energy, forestry, mining, and the fisheries. And in the last 9 years, the Liberal government has treated those as either relics from the past or environmental liabilities, and they aren't. They're fundamental building blocks. And so somebody will say, well, what the guy in the city, he can't relate to agriculture. He thinks that's cows and grain. You say, no. Okay, let's call it the food sector. Does he eat? Does she eat? And do they recognize that, yes, you've got a producing sector down here in agriculture. On top of that is an agriculture manufacturing sector. On top of that is an agricultural service sector. On top of that is an agricultural R&D, intellectual property sector. 90% of the jobs with respect to those are in the urban areas. So the urban voter, the urban consumer, has a vested interest in these producing sectors that are down here but are supporting all that wealth. And to get a political leadership that emphasizes that and takes pride in it, and I think that's the way to get a much broader base to your economic development than relying on one province. And if you want to look for oil, you better decide, do you want to have a private sector guys looking for it, or do you want to have civil servants looking for it? The old idea, Mexico expropriated all the private oil industries and created Petrobras, or whatever they called it. Their idea of a discovery well was a well 20 feet from the land producing well, because there was no risk. So I think there's a lot can be done to broaden out that whole base of the Canadian economy, but it requires recognizing all of those pillars and the need to develop. And we have this stuff.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Listen, I could talk to you for another 45 minutes, but I need to know, what have I not asked that I should be asking? Where am I missing the boat entirely? What do you want Canadians
Well,
to be asking?
I don't think so much missing the boat, but it points to be emphasized. One of the most important ones, I think, is where you started out. This business of looking at politics as through the lens of left, right, center, and there's still a lot of commentary in that the new axis, and this isn't just true, it's true in the United States, it's true in Britain, it's true in France, it's true Argentina, is through the aristocratic elite portion of the political spectrum versus the populist democratic bottom up. That's the new axis, and one has to decide which of those components are you going to identify with? And if it's with the populist side, then there's a couple of things one can do. What one can help shape and direct and energize this bottom-up energy, but make a major effort to inform its discretion, to use Jefferson's phrase, to equip the rank and file people who are mad and want to do something and have got lots of energy with the knowledge and skills that they need to make that a constructive contribution rather than a negative one.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, inform its discretion. I love that phrase.
Yeah.
I often tell people participatory democracy doesn't mean going to vote. It means a lot more than that. And that's what you're speaking to, I think.
Yeah, no, that's true. And this is another commentary on the declining state of democracy in Canada. The low declining turnout in just elections. In your recent Ontario election, you had a 43% turnout, which is the lowest in the province's history. The governing party gets 41% of that, which means that the governing party in Saskatchewan governs with the support of 16% of the population. Or put it the other way around, 84% of Ontario citizens and voters either thought so little about the election or the parties that they didn't even go to vote or voted for somebody else. And this is occurring right across the country, particularly at the municipal level. Virtually every major city, the mayor, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Regina, Winnipeg, Toronto, these municipal politicians get elected with a very low turnout, 35% turnout, and they get 20% or they get 40% of that, so that you got a mayor that's governing with 12-14% of the support of the electorate. That's a sad commentary on voting. And what I say to people that, well, I don't like any of them, so I'm not going to vote. Well, I say the people who choose to not vote in the politics of their country will be governed by those who do. So you don't like those who do. Get out and do something.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, it seems to be a vicious cycle. The less we participate in politics, the worse the politics becomes, and then it's a vicious cycle in that one way. And so on the one hand, we don't want to put our faith in princes, and often politics doesn't change things as much as we hope. Just because we have an election, a lot of things end up staying the same. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't participate, but more than just voting. So yeah, Preston, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. I love it anytime I get to.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. I enjoy these kind of discussions, and I hope they're helpful to people that watch them, because I think you and I would agree we're not just doing this for the sake of talking. It's important that Canadians become more involved and that they inform their own discretion if they won't let somebody else do it.
Yeah, well said. Well said. So as we wind down, I have to remind myself to do a better job of asking people to subscribe, like, and share a comment. If you've made it to the end of the show, thank you so much. And thank you once again, Preston. I look forward to what you're going to tackle next.
Okay, thank you, Shawn.
All right.